Hey everyone, so today I'm assembling my wheelchair from scratch, and along the way I'm hoping to show you how to make some minor adjustments, reinstall bearings, remove bearings, etc. Let's get to it. This bracket that holds the side guard just simply goes over the frame and tighten it down. And these will need adjusted once I get the back on the chair, so I can tell how far they are from the back and where they need to be. So I'm not going to tighten them down fully. Next are these brackets. I use the scissor lock brakes. So this part attaches to the frame. This slides into this bracket. So if your tires wear down and your brakes aren't working as well, all you need to do is loosen these two bolts and slide this back in a little bit. Or once you've replaced your tires and you have new tires with a lot of tread and you can't get your brakes locked because they're too tight, you would just loosen it and slide it a little bit further out. So next I'm putting on the piece that holds the back rest on. This you shouldn't really have to adjust or make any adjustments to it. Simply just slides on, and then there's two bolts on each side. And on this side you'll just have a nut on one side and be able to tighten it up from the other. And if you have a seat belt bracket, tighten it to where you can actually get the seat belt through. And next we're going to install the brackets on the back that actually hold the axle. I have the adjustable one so I can actually adjust the dump of my chair. With these, I actually measured before I took them off how far from the back it was, just so I had a general idea where I had it, so I didn't have to mess with it too long to figure out where I had the center of gravity. Because depending on how back or how forward you have the axle is how easy the chair will tip. So these simply just go on, two bolts, clamp along the frame, just like that. On here will go the mount that actually holds the axle. So based on whatever notch you want, this is where the axle fits through, and then you can adjust it on these ridges, how high you want the back of the chair to sit or versus how low, to get a little bit more of a dump in your chair. And I just kept track where I had it before I took it apart, because I'm not gonna lie, I took a few pictures also just to be sure. Makes things easier. And that's on there. I left this bracket a little bit loose so I can once I get the axle in there and straight, then I'll tighten these bolts up. So now we're gonna do the foot plate bracket. These tubes are actually what go up into the tube of the frame. This adapter is what holds it tight and allows you to adjust it up and down, which is pretty nifty, because if you can see, this wedge is actually held on by a screw that goes up through and attaches to that. And when the wedge is up like that, it allows it to slide into the tube, but as you tighten the bolt, it comes down, gets wider, and actually holds it in place. So if you need to adjust, raise, or lower your foot plate, you would loosen this bottom screw, adjust it up or down, and then tighten it back up, and you're good to go. And a quick note on that, if you would loosen this bolt too much, this little piece would actually fall off inside the tube. And this would be a lot easier if you were working on a bench. I'm working on my lap in a trash can and trying to film, so when you're putting it back together, you would actually just put these down inside of the tube of the chair. And I already did this one, and you can see how easy they go in when that wedge is actually loose. Then you would take your foot plate adapter bracket and you would slide it down inside. So once you get it on, it'll look like that, and then you just tighten these up. I'm gonna leave it loose just because I don't have the casters or anything on, so I don't know exactly where this was. This also gives me a chance to clean up, there we go, that are not rusted bad, just need cleaned up. So I'd say they needed cleaned a little bit. I cleaned them up with WD-40, but as a lubricant, I use either dry lubricant or white lithium grease when I'm actually reassembling them. Don't use WD-40 as a lubricant. Now on to the forks. This piece will go on the inside and this piece goes in from this direction. Get it to where the hole lines up, and this is where the shaft of the fork goes, but as long as this is lined up, then this shaft will fit through here, and then the fork goes on there. So this is adjust your caster, and the smaller bolt goes through here. Tighten it up. You can adjust the caster back and forth once you get those on. And instead of having 100 screws laying around while I was waiting, I always put the screws back where they came from so I know where they went. Remove the 2 screws from the back here. The tubing for the backrest just simply slides down on, line it up straight. There we go. Slides down on, and then put the screws back in. Snug those up. So we're getting there, starting to look like a chair again, and there's fewer parts laying around. So now on to the fun part, the bearings, so that you don't end up like I did and messing one of them up because I was in a hurry and wasn't really paying attention or thinking. So the bearings that fit down into the fork, there's 2 of them. These are the old ones. Let's see if you can see this here. Once the first bearing is seated the whole way down in, then if you see the groove halfway, one of these retainer clips fits into that to hold that bearing in place. And then the last bearing goes and sits in top. And that's what slides up onto the bolt going up to the fork. And that's what will hold your fork onto your wheelchair. I try to use what I have on hand. So to get them out, I actually didn't really have anything great. So I used a socket that was big enough to sit around the outside edge, but to allow the bearing to be punched out when I sat it on top, and used a punch to sit on the edge of the top bearing and punch it out. But instead of thinking the first time, I put a punch down through it and tap it out. Well, this is how it ended up. The first bearing, since it was held in this retainer clip, it wasn't budging, so it gave way and busted. So now I know for next time not to do that, and to let you know why, if you're trying to get those bearings out at the same time, why they might not be budging when you're trying to tap them out, because of this simple little retainer clip. So to put them back in, I'm just using an actual 2x4, which works perfect for the fork to sit down on and give me something to rest, and I'll be able to put, actually that one slid down in. And then this retainer clip, it's handier if you have an actual pair of pliers for it. I just used an old pair of needle nose that I wasn't concerned about, and I just ground them down with a grinder. Put more of a point on them to work. So how these work are, if I can show you here. So once you squeeze this, and it goes flying, so then you grab the other one. When you squeeze these retainer clips together, it makes it smaller in order for it to actually fit down in, and then when it releases, it fills that groove in there and actually is held in place, and then you can go ahead and put your other bearing on top of it. And once it's in there, the bearing's in there, and then that retainer clip holds the first bearing in, and then you just tap your top bearing in. So I knew I wasn't going to get lucky for both of them, so this one needs tapped down a little bit. And then once it's started, so there are actual tools made to probably press these in and press them out, but what I do is just use a socket that's as big as the inside diameters to sit it on, then I can tap it down on. So once that one's seated in there, do the same thing with the retaining clip. As long as you get the C-clip started in and let it seat down into that groove, and you'll hear it snap in there. And then onto the top bearing, just sit it on there. And it'd be flush and ready to go. So now that you have your forks, new bearings in your forks and ready to go on, there's a little bushing or little piece that goes on, and it'll sit on the fork like that up over top of this, and then you'll just slide your fork on. You have a washer and a lock nut, and do the same to the other side. Slide it down over, the other fork on, and washer and nut. And when you're tightening the forks up, You want to tighten them to where they're snug. You want them to still move freely. So if you get them a little bit too tight, just back it off just a little until they move nice and free, but they're not wobbling. So now that they're on, footrests on, back's on, starting to come together here. And for the casters, I'll link a video above to removing and replacing and even re-greasing the bearings in the casters. Right now mine aren't that bad, so I'm not going to go through and replace them. Plus I'm going to be putting new casters on here in the next month or so anyway. Well, actually this one side is bad, so I guess we will see how it goes. Again, I'm just using something that's big enough to fit around here and allow the bearing to come out when I'm tapping it out. And you just kind of work your way around the edge. You have to get it in and get on the lip of the bottom bearing. You're actually taking this bearing out. You got to tap it from this side and work your way around, gently tapping it. And then this comes out. And be sure to keep this spacer because the spacer goes in between them. This one's not terrible. The other side, it won't even, I don't know if you can see, but it won't even turn. It definitely needs out. And then that one's easier because it's open then. And just tap it out. And that gives you a reason to clean up your casters a little bit. And hope that I have spare bearings on hand. And since the one bearing's good, I'm gonna tap it back in. There wasn't anything wrong with this one. And be sure to put the spacer back in between and tap the other bearing in. Now you're good to go. So now to put the casters on, and also for the bearing, we'll link Richard with Wheels to Walk and did a much better detailed video with replacing these bearings in the casters. I'll link that above. On installing the casters onto the chair, I know on mine, if you have like an offset caster, that there are different size spacers that go in the fork when you put it in. You'll want this longer spacer on the side that has more of an offset, and the shorter spacer on the side, of course, that's not as much of an offset. And then you'll line this up to whichever setting that you want and simply put the axle through. And a lot of times it doesn't go on that easy because the spacer that's in between the two bearings might not be lined up for the axle to slide through. So you might have to use like a small screwdriver or something to get it to line up when you're putting it on, like this one. And you can use anything to get it to line up. I just have an Allen wrench laying here and tighten them up and the caster will still spin freely. And now on to the next part. The axle, it will simply just slide through. Once these, the bolts are loosened on the brackets, it'll slide through and into the other one. That's why I didn't tighten those brackets up. You want it to be straight. And then once that's on there, it's starting to look like a chair. So before I tightened these up, I made sure that both brackets on each side were the same distance from the back, and by moving this forward or back will change the center of gravity of the chair. So the further back it is, the more stable the chair is. The further forward and shorter wheelbase cause you to flip if it's too far forward and you're not used to it. And you want to make sure those are really snug. If you have camber, the angle of the camber is up and down. So now for the backrest. Mine actually take these little plastic inserts in order for it to fit inside the tube. Like I said, I put all the screws in the parts so I knew where they went. Simply slide these down in. There's adjustments on the side to where, depending on how high. And like I said, the removable side guard brackets, where they needed to slide up. So that's why I kept them loose. I can slide these up until they're where they should be and then tighten that bracket back up. Try to explain what I meant by the camber on the axle tube. Instead of towing in or towing out, it'll actually be cambered. So you have to make sure if you do have camber that the axle tube is correctly positioned or orientated. So once the camber tube's adjusted correctly and you have the same amount on both sides, you can go ahead and tighten up that bolt and that bolt. The foot plate, you can just put these bolts down through and down through here, and the nut actually slides into this little groove, so you don't actually have to use a wrench to hold it, and then you can tighten it down. If you need to adjust the foot plate or angle your foot plate, all you have to do is loosen those 2 top screws and simply rotate it and then tighten them back. On to the next part. Now back to the casters. When it's rolling, you want it to roll smoothly, of course. So if you actually have it like the whole way back like that, it's not gonna roll right. It's not gonna roll right at all. That will allow you to move your caster forward or back and rotate it. So you just have to line those up to where they roll correctly and they're both making contact with the ground before you tighten them back up. So next we'll do the seat sling. It simply just has these metal rods that slide up through on each side. And on the back, if you notice you start sagging in your seat, you can always try to Velcro this and pull it a little bit tighter and see if that helps. But that simply just lays on here and you gotta line up 10 holes, 5 on each side, put the little screws in. Also, if you have a pouch and you have straps that hold it on, you'll want to put those around the frame and in between these 2 screws before you tighten it down. That way it'll prevent the pouch from sliding down by your feet. And before you tighten all the ones on one side, make sure you get all 10 of them started, because if you tighten all on one side, then you won't be able to as easily line these holes up on the other side. So once you get them all started, then you can go through and tighten them all up. Bad guesstimate on the brakes. They have to go way back, but simply just loosen these 2 bolts, slide the whole bracket back, tighten the bracket up, and then you can adjust the brake inside of the bracket then also. And we're pretty much back in business. Those are my basketball wheels, but I have my orange wheels and I have another set of white Spinergies that will go on this one now.